It's not quite true that we were turned down by every studio in town, that nobody wanted the film. Some of the larger studios, I remember Paramount specifically, was very interested in the script. People wanted the script. They liked the script. They saw the potential. What they didn't want was me. You know, a director with you know, calling myself a director, first-time director, no credits, or one very questionable credit from which I'd gotten fired, which is arguably worse. But I knew that if I sold it, I'd have money for a year or so to live on, but I would be right back where I started from. And by this point, I had started to really believe in the project and thought that there was real potential there myself. So I held on to it pretty tenaciously. And you know, one of the agreements that Gale and I had going into it was that we wouldn't sell the project, that we would stick together as a team, that I wouldn't do it without her, she wouldn't do it without me, and we would not sell it and allow it to be taken over by third parties. Now, ultimately, that's a harder choice for a producer to make, if you think about it, because there's always room for another producer, but there's never room for a second director. So, you know, I was the one at greater risk. She was the one that had the harder kind of moral dilemma on that.
He told me early on about this story that he had. He didn't have all the pieces and the parts completely together. But he was very specific and clear. He knew what he wanted, and the parts that he didn't have yet, he knew what they had to be. And he was going to hunt them down. There was this process of you know, kicking ideas back and forth. That's not authorship, it's the thing we all do.
I eventually brought Bill Wisher into it after I'd pretty much worked out the storyline and was well on my way writing the script.
And he called me up, and the treatment had already been finished and everything, and he said, look, I got to get this thing done quickly. You know it better than anyone except me. Would you take certain scenes and turn them into script scenes out of the thing? And I said, sure.
Bill actually made a contribution in terms of, I think, a couple of the dialogue scenes, some of the tough cop dialogue, I think, at the police station.
The Vukovich-Traxler scenes, all the police station stuff. And I did that based on his treatment, and I worked on that.
I think he was responsible for Reese's line, he'll reach down her throat and pull her blanking heart out. That's a Bill Wisher line.
And I think a few other things, Sarah and her girlfriend and all of that stuff. I, at one point, was living down in Orange County, and he was out in the valley, and this was before we had any money. You know, there were no computers and stuff. So we had to have this the next day for some reason, and I had to write it, and then I went and picked up the phone, and he had a tape recorder, and I said, okay, now you're going to read this into the phone, and I'm going to tape it. And then it was transcribed, and it was sort of, you know, a caveman fax machine sort of thing.
Jim and I used to work a lot and spend a lot of time together, talk about the character and where he came from. And we'd drive around, shoot guns, and have fun. And he'd show me how to hotwire a car. And he set me up with a guy to, you know, to learn martial arts. I first got involved in martial arts when I started working on that show. So I had a lot of time that I worked on that. I did a lot of research on the Warsaw Ghetto, about all the guys that used to, like, you know, kind of live in the rubble of the Warsaw Ghetto when they're fighting the Germans, and what their lives were like, and how they managed through all those tunnels and hideaways, and how they fought the Germans and stuff.
Jim had a vision. I mean, he really did. And he had done this short film prior to, I don't know, a year before or so, where he had a model that he had built of an HK hunter killer. It was a smaller scale. He brought it over during pre-production in a box and stuck it down. And this, I know, you know, I can't really use this, but this is an idea of what I did and kind of what I want. And he had his drawings that he had done, an original drawing of a hunter killer, and he storyboarded out the future war sequences. And that's the one area in the script that it's like half a page of exposition on the future wars, and from the script you wouldn't have a clue about what was going to be visually done on screen. But he had it in his head what it was, and it came out in the boards. I mean, things did get changed and enhanced along the way, but overall, I'm saying he had a pretty clear vision about what he wanted and what he wanted things to look like. This wasn't like something I'll know it when I see it. He knew what he wanted.
At the point that we were put on hold, I had pretty much storyboarded the film, done most of the pre-visualization, lined up the effects companies, worked with Stan Winston designing the Terminator. We were at a point where we were ready to start shooting in about a month. So I only needed 4 weeks of prep. I didn't really need to do anything until, say, mid-January or toward the end of January of '84. So all of a sudden I have this yawning abyss of 6 months in front of me with nothing to do. I can't go off and direct another film, should I be so lucky. So all I could really do was write. So I took the script that we had not shot yet, that we were trying to keep top secret, and I shopped it through an agent as a writing sample. So I actually managed to land on the merits of the writing 2 projects, which proved to be pivotal. So it all worked out the way it was supposed to work out, or I certainly couldn't have had it work out any better. The 2 projects were Alien 2, which became Aliens, and First Blood 2, which became Rambo, First Blood Part 2, The Mission. So I used that period of time to write those 2 scripts, and it was a mad scramble to get them done, and then I had to basically kind of drop Aliens or Alien 2 unfinished, turn it in as it was, and get on to the final prep on Terminator. I agreed to write Alien 2 on the basis and on the sole basis that I directed. They came back, as any wise producer would, talking to somebody who hadn't even directed their first film yet, and said, "Kid, this is a big project. We'll give you a best efforts clause." Well, you know, a best efforts clause, you could take all the sincerity in a best efforts clause and pack it into a flea's navel and still have room left over for 2 caraway seeds and an agent's heart, as they say. So, but, I took them at their word, and I had a certain faith in Walter Hill's integrity, just because I liked Walter and I respected him, and I thought that he would do his best. Now, what that meant, if push came to shove, and if Terminator had been a dog, I don't think it would have helped much with the studio. Well, it turns out that Terminator became this surprise hit of the fall season of '84, and all of a sudden I was a hot commodity, and I just happened to have this film that I wanted to make. And then it was no problem having me, attached to direct Alien 2, which I called Aliens. But the problem then was that, my new agent and all the people around me and everybody that was suddenly my new best friend all said, "Oh, you can't do Alien 2. You can't do Alien 2. That would be career suicide. Don't do Alien 2. It's a no-win situation. If it's good, it'll only be because Ridley Scott's classic was so good and it's just on momentum. And if it's bad, it's because you're not Ridley Scott and you can only be held up in a negative comparison, blah, blah, blah." So I ignored them and made the movie anyway.
Most of the revisions, I think, to the script, as I recollect, there were a lot of budgetary revisions. Which is simply is you can't have this and you can't have that. That goes out, this goes out, that goes out. Jim has always written very long screenplays because he wants to get all of it down, and then there's a lot of editing that goes on. And sometimes the editing goes on before the camera's rolling, and sometimes it has to go on afterwards. Things were scaled down a little bit, and some things were edited. There were a lot of helicopters. They all went away. I think Jim was so exasperated. He said, "What do you want them to do? Use bad language?" I mean, they wanted explosions out and guns out and all kinds of stuff out. But, he ended up with what he had to go shoot. There's a rawness to it that gives it an energy, and even that slight low-budget feeling to it all, I think really works. I've always said, at the end of the day, I'm very proud of Terminator 2, and I think it is a wonderful picture, but Terminator's the better of the 2.
Gale and I agreed to be a team and to fight back to back against all comers, and that's what we did. I remember her being out there yanking cable around at 4 o'clock in the morning to try to make a shot before the sun came up. That's the kind of hands-on, guerrilla filmmaker that she is and was. I was the same way, and it was a good partnership. It served us both well. I think the best relationship between a producer and director, when those are divided roles, is the producer is the brakes and the director is the gas. The director wants everything. They want the sky, the moon. They want 12,000 mounted horsemen to come over the horizon to make a great shot. And the producer wants to do it all with one guy and a sagebrush and some off-screen sound effects of pounding hoofs. Obviously, the best film is going to be somewhere in the middle there. You can't cheap out. People expect to be entertained. They expect to be surprised. They want to see something they haven't seen before. If you don't give them that, it's cheesy. And cheesiness is the death of film, even a clever film, even a film with a good story. On the other hand, we've certainly seen umpteen examples of overkill, where people spend too much money and get carried away. And I've even been accused of that, although I think that I've tried to keep a balance as I've gone along. But certainly on Terminator, our first sort of serious film, we had to do it for a budget. The budget was ultimately turned out to be around $6 million, I think.
One of my favorite parts of the movie is when I'm leaving the department store and I come running out of the top of the department store and jump off this banister behind this police car and then come running out. And of course, it was the stunt guy that came outside, jumped off the banister, took this 20-foot fall behind the police car. I was sitting down there. As soon as he landed, I got up and ran off, you know. So Jim was always coming up with stuff like that. But it makes me look pretty good. Makes me look like I did that jump.
Stan and I hit it off right away. I mean, he's just such a hoot. And we both have such a passion for really cool fantasy characters that we had to work together. Stan put a lot of time in, and his guys put a lot of time in creating these effects and trying to make sure that the budget was workable with what we had to spend. I said, look, this is how much we've got. Can we make this work? And he always maintained after the fact that he took a bath on that film. But it led to other things. It sort of ratcheted him up to a new level of acceptance in the effects community. It certainly blew me up like 3 levels, you know, but Stan, you know, Stan was already on that path. But I think it pushed him up, and he's always credited the film as a turning point for him, moving into the kind of the mainstream.
Jim, I've always thought, was great with actors. I talk about him being precise and meticulous at letting an actor kind of bring what he could to the story also. And, you know, when you have a writer who's also directing, there's a certain confidence that they have when you're talking about the character, maybe making some minor changes that other people who get the script don't have. And Jim has always been very open to me, not changing anything in his movie, but rearranging dialogue, or maybe dropping a piece of dialogue, or adding a piece here and there to help create the vision that he wants. Always completely open, always open in rehearsals, and always listening if you got something good to say. The character that I played in the Terminator was the best character that I ever played, without a doubt.
The interesting thing is not so much how good Linda is in the first film. The really interesting thing is how good she is in the second film, how well she as a person and as an actor was able to fulfill the prophecy of the character. It was amazing. Now, whether I'd love to take credit for having seen all that within her, but frankly, I think we were both too young and inexperienced to be able to claim that at that point. And so obviously we both grew into a kind of a synchronicity that really pays off well in the second film.
My first films were television films, and getting into prosthetic characters, going from Gargoyles, then my first year out of my apprenticeship, and then with the same company doing Jane Pittman and winning a second Emmy, and then being cast because of the old black lady, Miss Jane Pittman. Then the following year doing the series Roots, because I was the guy who did the black age makeups. And going from that to working with Diana Ross, because she had seen all of the wonderful age makeups, and she was doing a multitude of characters for a Diana Ross special, and I worked with her. And then The Wiz came out, and I was the guy who did all of the black prosthetic makeups. I was the black makeup artist from California, until we found out when I went to New York, and they all went, oh my goodness, he's a little old Jew. And so in The Wiz, of the characters that I developed there, one of the characters that I created and designed, was a part of the design and the makeup, was the Tin Man. That character was seen by a producer who was doing a movie called Heartbeeps. And I became the guy who does the robotic face makeups, and so I ended up doing the characters for this movie Heartbeeps, which were robotic characters. And from that, the rock band Styx saw those characters, and they were doing their album and their video, and it was Mr. Roboto. And so I ended up doing the robot, Mr. Roboto, for Styx. So I was the guy who did the robotic makeups. So, and you can see how this line just generally went straight ahead. And then Jim Cameron was doing Terminator. And I know that he had contacted Dick Smith and talked to him in New York about what he should do, where he should go. And Dick went, oh, well, Stan Winston, you know, has got a shop that is sizable, and he does those, you know, robotic makeups. So that's where it all came. That's all that happened. It happened because I was the guy who does the robots in the movies.
We shot that in downtown Los Angeles in the middle of the night, and I got suited up as this LAPD officer, and they gave me this prop revolver and badge and hat. And around midnight, you know, all of the sewers open up and the strange guys start crawling out and say, "Oh, you're making a movie." And there were some LAPD cops there, but the crowd started to get bigger and bigger and bigger and odder and stranger. So at one point they said, "Hey, listen, you're not doing anything. Do you want to be a cop for an hour?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, sure, that'll be great." So the guy handed me a walkie-talkie. He said, like, "We're on Channel 4, and you go down there, and, you know, when the cars are going by and so forth and so on, you keep people back, and you're in charge of that area." And I went, "Oh, great." So I got to be a cop. Well, I noticed a couple of odd things over that hour or two that I was doing it, which is that, number one, people never look in your eyes. They don't look at your face. And they will do whatever you say, which is kind of fun, but they never look in your face. And I remember after a couple of hours, everybody's eyes would go to the badge or they'd go to the gun when they're talking to you. And I remember thinking after a while that it was kind of odd, and it made me feel a little funny, like I wasn't a person. And it was just a thing. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, I'm feeling this after an hour and a half. What do cops feel like after 5, 10 years? Anyway, I thought it was kind of an interesting experience, and I had a lot more respect for cops after that who managed to still be human beings, because it's a very dehumanizing job before you even get into the bad stuff. That's just controlling traffic.
While we were making the Terminator, summer of 1984, we had this medfly scare in Los Angeles, and so they started spraying Los Angeles, and they would spray, you know, the San Fernando Valley one day and Pomona the next day. And it seemed like our locations somehow ended up matching their spraying areas. Instead of getting sprayed once, we got sprayed like 5 times, you know, because they would move to an area and that's where we'd be shooting that day. They'd move to another area and that's where we'd be shooting that day. So we got sprayed on a lot.
Jim wanted to use those techniques of, you know, hanging wires on models, doing a lot of high-speed photography, in-camera effects particularly, as opposed to what was the rage at the time technologically, which was motion control, was really coming in big time. And a number of the other companies around at that time were all going heavy into motion control. In my opinion, overusing it. It's like what tends to happen with any new technology that comes on board. People tend to grab it and then try to fit everything into it. And then you end up with lots of shots that should have been done a different way. And the motion control tended to have a certain look to it, and Jim didn't want that. He wanted, and the term he always used was gritty. And what he meant is he wanted it to look, you know, real and not have any chance that it looked like, you know, effects.
I think Jim went to Gene because he knew his reputation of putting it all in camera and the cost-saving aspects of that.
I mean, I recognized in Gene Warren the kind of work that Bob and Denny Skotak did, and that I enjoyed doing personally when I was doing effects. So they seemed like the right guys for it, not overly technologically kind of carried away. And also they were inexpensive. You know, I knew that they could do good work for not so much money, and we didn't have much money. Well, I think that the idea of a cyborg, maybe not exactly as it's shown in Terminator, but the idea of a humanoid robot or some amalgam between cybernetics, mechanics, and organic tissue is inevitable. It's probably going to come from the other direction rather than a machine, kind of a wolf in sheep's clothing, which is what the Terminator was, where the organic portion of it was there as a disguise. That's a pretty far-fetched concept. But I think that it'll come from the other direction, which is that human beings will replace more and more of themselves with artificial alternatives, whether it's because parts are wearing out or because they want enhanced performance or because they want to perform specialized tasks. And eventually I can imagine a human organic brain, which I think is going to be a long way off before we can duplicate that, inside a synthetic body at the bottom of the ocean on Triton, you know, in some distant star system. So I think we're going to be heading that direction, and that won't be a choice that a lot of people are going to want to make, but some people will make that choice.
My normal practice is to request screenings without temp music. They probably had temp music, but I don't think I ever heard it. In fact, I know I didn't hear it, and that's another little anecdote, because I would score scenes once I got the film, and then Jim would come in and I'd show him stuff. So then I would work reel by reel, whatever material they would give me. And he wondered why I didn't want to hear the temp track, because I think he had some stuff on there that he liked, and I requested not to listen to it. And when we got down to the love scene, I played him the love scene with this piano theme, you know, this romantic. It gets a little harder as it goes, but still it's featuring solo piano. And he was like, "Show me that again." And I played it for him again, and he said, I get it now. He said, I understand, because he said, if I had showed you that temp, I had something so totally different in that love scene. I had just almost more action music. It was just really hard still and mechanical, and you might have heard that and never have done this, and yet this brings the whole sort of soul of the film out, the heart of this is about the future. They're making love is going to create the baby. There's a whole soulful story connection with the lovemaking that his temp music didn't do, and that was one of those instances where the music really worked for him because it supported the whole, and it was different than what he had put in that worked with the scene but didn't support the story that much.
I'd say a good percentage of the fan base loved the Terminator, loved the idea of him just kicking the door in and hosing everybody in sight. I think that certainly by the time we got to doing the second film, I realized that it wasn't a good idea for people to be identifying so much with the Terminator if he was this, he was supposed to be death, he was supposed to be scary, like the alien in Alien. He was supposed to scare the crap out of you, and you were supposed to identify with the good guys, with Sarah and Reese. When I realized that that wasn't happening 100%, it made me a little nervous. Yes, I was happy to have the success of the film, but after having gone off and done Aliens and then The Abyss, and it was 6 years later, when we sat down to do Terminator 2, I said, I don't want to take this in the same direction any further. So I torqued it around and had the Terminator be the good guy. Now, yeah, he's still a violent guy. He still kicks the door in, but he doesn't shoot everybody. Well, shoots a few of them in the knees.
I think that for that film, the, quote, synthesizer was the perfect medium. I could get what I needed from it, and that's why I used it. If I don't have the sound, I'll create it with my breathing. The main clank in T1 is a sample of me, I just got really frustrated. I said, I need this sound, and I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a big cast iron frying pan, held it up in front of a mic, and just hit it with a hammer, clank, and it distorted because the technology that I was sampling into had very bad, at that point, the sample rates and the frequency response were really limited. So part of the distortion and the limitation of the technology is part of that signature clank. And it's a really important part of the film. And if I had a beautiful sampler that didn't have the distortion, it probably would have sounded like a frying pan. Once it got rolling, I remember at one point being at the dubbing stage and something didn't work for Jim, even after he'd approved it, sometimes on the stage when you mix with the effects, and running home at lunch and screaming into a sampler, literally, for one more sting when the hand comes in the pressing. We'd done all these strings stings, high violins, and we need a new sting because it was like the end, and those were getting old, and it was like, what can I do? What's the scary thing? I said, the human voice shrieking in terror, So I actually, I think myself and the several other people that were around screamed into a microphone, ah, like that, and then I played it, and we put it into a sampling, and I played it on the keyboard in this dissonant notes, and you can hear it, at one of those last times where Sarah almost gets grabbed in the press. You hear this, ah! And it's a sound you've never heard anywhere else in the film before. It's like, so that's it, the memory is like one more level, one more notch, one better, more, just keep driving. That's my main memory.
Jim shoots what he needs to make the scene work, and he knows that this shot will get you up to here, and then you'll cross-cut to here, and then the second part of that shot may go to here, and so forth. He had really choreographed it out very, very well. But they were used to perhaps less visual directors or less visionary directors who would shoot like this big wide master shot, and then they shoot the medium shot and maybe the two shot and then maybe the over the shoulders and the closest. That's your traditional coverage. And there's nothing wrong with that when it works, but they weren't getting that. They were getting Jim's vision. And so they said, well, can't you talk to him? Can't you get him to shoot a master shot? And I said, I can tell you now, I'm looking at this footage, it was a tech noir sequence. This stuff, it's going to go together beautifully. Because I see he just got just the perfect stuff. And there's Reese looking in the mirror and turning around just as Sarah turns around, and there's Terminator lifting his gun, and Reese cocking his shotgun, and Sarah watching as the laser beam sights, the laser sight goes on her forehead. I could see it in my head when I saw these dailies. It's obviously there, and I think it's a wonderful scene. And so let's just say it was a very exciting time to be editing that picture.
Mark made a phenomenal contribution to the film because I had very little experience with editing. And Mark is a truly inspired editor, especially when it comes to action. And he's best, ironically, not when you give him a wealth of footage. He's best when you don't give him enough, because that's what really separates the men from the boys as an editor. Almost anybody can cut a great action sequence if you give them, you know, 4 weeks worth of second unit photography and angles up the wazoo. But if you've got threadbare coverage, which we had on Terminator, and you can make it exciting, then, you know, you are a man, my son, in the editing game. And Mark did that, and I think he made us look good. He made us look good in that film, and of course, gave me an opportunity to see that process and see how you do it and to not lose faith. And also made me think of filmmaking in a different way, or more clearly, let's say, and to apply the editorial process to the shooting process. If you can make a scene hinge on an insert of a shoe as a door opens because you don't have a wide shot of the guy walking into the room and use that to create suspense, then it's all fair game. I think the film worked because it operated on different levels. On its surface level, it was a down dirty action film, you know, but it also had some big ideas in it, and I think that because it worked on two different levels, a kind of an intellectual level and just kind of on its face as a thriller, it's delivering to different audiences which are overlapping audiences. I think that there were intriguing aspects of it. It looked fresh, it was something new, something people hadn't really seen, even though I think of it as recombinant DNA, because Blade Runner and Westworld, and there were definite predecessors, conceptual predecessors, but it was a fresh combination. There's a whole other level to it, though, which is the idea of the human simulacrum. Goes back into myth a long way, from the golem stories to, you know, there are many, many stories throughout folklore and mythology of the human simulation, made out of clay or made out of stone or made out of wood. So now, you know, we just turn that in the technological age into made out of steel and titanium and hyperalloy. That's, for some reason, is a fundamental idea, and I don't know if where it comes from psychologically. I have my suspicions that in our age, where we meet so many strangers, which is a very different thing from the way we evolved. When we evolved, we were in a finite group. Occasionally we might have met another group, but certainly we would not have gone through a lifetime without being able to remember every single person we met. Now we're confronted with landscapes filled with people and faces that we don't know. And it goes against our fundamental hardwiring. And I think that what it does is it creates fears and anxieties about the person you don't know. And you know, what are they like? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they even human? Combine that with a kind of an urban landscape where people tend to be dehumanized. They're performing jobs. When a cop comes up to you, or a doctor, or even a bank teller, when you meet a stranger, but you have to, in the course of performing your job, interact with that stranger, especially if you're in a position of power or authority, you clamp down, you repress your humanity, you're not friendly, you're not open, you don't shake hands with them. You have a very machine-like demeanor. And of course, the more people there are, especially in big cities, the more strangers we encounter, the more those strangers play an interactive role with us, but don't interact as friends. They interact in a very machine-like way, following a kind of prescribed code of social behavior, which is their kind of programming, their kind of software. So I think that we're also reacting psychologically to this kind of dehumanization, or programming ourselves to interact with strangers. And I think that that's why the kind of the android myth has become so popular in recent years.
There were some things that we took out, mostly small moments. Probably the major thing that we took out was a scene where Sarah Connor calls her mother, and after she hangs up the phone, she looks in the phone book and on a whim looks up Cyberdyne systems. And she has this idea, why don't we go and blow them up? And Reese doesn't think it's necessarily a good idea because there's something about changing history and it may not be a good thing. These are all, by the way, very heavy science fiction themes that come up now and again. And then they have a big argument, and then Reese breaks down.
And saying that he doesn't belong here, he shouldn't be here, it's wrong, it's all wrong, this place is wrong. And, you know, it was an emotional scene. And at the time I thought that I needed that, because I think the audience needed to know who he was.
And kind of, in a sense, may have stalled the picture at a certain point. Although, as a scene unto itself, it's as I say, it's very, very meaty stuff.
And when I first was told that it was cut, I was disappointed, as all actors are, because you spend a day or two working. That was what I thought was the meatiest scene in the movie for me. That was where I was going to really show my acting chops and stuff, you know. And so it ended up on the cutting room floor. But what I realized is that that scene is in my entire performance throughout, from beginning to end.
Because of that, we took out what was a coda scene. in the picture. After the Terminator was crushed, we cut back inside to the factory. There's a number of technicians who discover this crushed up thing, and they find this chip. And in fact, the factory that the final scenes take place in is Cyberdyne Systems.
There were a couple of reasons that we went in mono rather than stereo. One was that stereo wasn't really all that common at the time. It wasn't unusual to have a film released in mono. And secondly, we really had run out of money, and it was expensive both in terms of the amount of mix time as well as the sound effects had already been built mono and would have had to been re-prepared in stereo, and we didn't have the time or the money.
The film was in mono because it was going to cost an extra $40,000 to do it in stereo, and Hemdale was too cheap to spend the money. That's the answer. There's your answer in a nutshell. It's funny, you never forget numbers like that.
All I knew was there was a choice. It would cost more money to do the stereo, and they didn't have it. The bit about the mono, for me, was worrisome just because, especially when you're dealing with synthesizers and electronic sources, space, the stereo space, is how you give them depth, because like a violin played in a room, even in mono, has a certain natural depth because the air is really moving. So even if you only capture it with one mic and play it through one speaker, you get that space. It's harder with these sampled and electronic sounds because they're really electronic signals. You have to sort of create this space as an artifice. You have to add it, you know, electronically. And it's much easier if you get the choice to put things left and right. But it was interesting because we would pre-mix the effects on the dubbing stage, on the mixing stage. And Jim would say, more of this, you know, and everything's going on this one track. And then we'd bring in the music and he'd go, the music's not as powerful as it was. And we would say, well, Jim, you know, this is mono-optical, which meant not only was it one speaker, but there was frequency response limitation, you know, so you don't get the brilliance either. So it wasn't just the placement in space, it was a limitation on the frequency response, which of course really made me nuts. But he would think, well, why can't I hear it all? And that's why, you know, you still have that. No matter what happens, even in stereo, you have to figure out what's powerful at any given moment. And in this film, there's moments where everything needs to be powerful. So it was a bit of a train wreck sometimes trying to get all the information on this one track.
But not one person has yet complained to me that the film experience was somehow less because the film was in mono.
When we first showed Hemdale the film, and I had given them many, many caveats about the fact that the last reel was not complete, it didn't have all its effect shots and so on, they basically dragged me by the scruff of my neck, metaphorically, into their office and in front of all the top Orion brass from back east, because the corporate headquarters were in New York. Everybody had flown out for this screening, or for other business and scheduled the screening. They dragged me into the office and they said, you have to cut the entire last reel out of the movie. I said, what? I said, when the gas truck blows up and the Terminator burns, Sarah cries, Reese is dead, we roll credits. If you have to reshoot a shot or two, whatever, to make that happen, we do it. You're the filmmaker. You can figure out how to do it. I said, I'm the filmmaker? Then, as the filmmaker, I say, no, no, no. You have to kill me if you want that to be the end of the movie. And basically kind of walked out of the office, which you don't do, you know. But I just thought, you know, that they had absolutely zero connection to this film. So we had to go off. I had to spend my own money. I spent, I don't know, 40 grand of my own money that I had been paid. There was no kind of slush fund someplace because I was, you know, I was pretty much broke when I started the film. So basically spent most of what I earned on the film on reshoots, not reshoots, but additional shots. Shots we dropped as we went along. Little things, inserts, effect shots, you know, the eye going out. Little moments that really made, I think, a huge difference in that last reel that had all been just slugged before. They weren't helping us at all. And somehow managed to get the film done, managed to bring it back and screen it for them. And then they all went, oh, okay, all right, it's fine.
The original shoot of the punk scene, for whatever reasons, the casting didn't quite work. And there wasn't really money in the budget for reshoots. I don't believe that insurance covers bad acting. And Jim decided in that particular case he needed to simply go back and recast and do it over again. So he recast his friends, people that he had worked with, that he knew, that he liked, Bill Paxton, Brian Thompson, and Brad Reardon. And of course it made all the difference in the scene.
Like an actor, you can also get typecast. Though I had a fair amount of experience before this and did some noticeable projects, both as features and television, period piece orchestra stuff, those went totally out of everybody's recognition, and I was the Terminator guy. Prior to Terminator, I had dabbled. I always was very interested in synthesizers, and I'd use them as elements in scores, but it was the first score I did where it was really from the bottom up, designed sound by sound to be unique for that picture. This film demanded of me, I said, I can't just put normal everyday sounds, a normal drum, a normal, you know, though there's some of those tucked in there, that the things that you really hear, I wanted them to be recognizable as music and move you as music, and yet have them sort of come from your nightmare, come from a dream, not be the exact, if there's a timpani, it's not the timpani that you've heard before. Suggestive of a timpani, but it also sounds like the heartbeat of a machine. And that actually, it did cause me to get more into the sampling and electronics in order to do that.
Brad made a phenomenal contribution, and he's another person on the film that sort of took a bath to extend beyond, to go the extra mile. And especially for that time, you know, when synth scores were not as common as they are now. All synth scores, anyway. He did the whole score in his garage, so it was a very down and dirty score, but it still had a kind of a scope and a vision to it. And it was very kind of lean and tense, but it also had a kind of an epic quality. The melody was epic, and it worked. It worked perfectly for the film. It was exactly the right size for the film.
At the end of the picture, Sarah Connor stops for gas at a gas station. A little boy who works there snaps a picture and then runs off and says there's a storm coming in. And what happened there was that the little boy couldn't really do his lines very well, and he was kind of self-conscious. And we had a problem. We couldn't really use him. Finally, Jim and Gale found another young actor who looked somewhat, but not really like the kid who was in the original shoot. So they thought, well, what we'll do is we'll reshoot the close-ups. Then they realized they didn't have the shirt that the kid wore in the scene. So Gale approached the parents of the kid and wanted to buy the shirt, I'm sure at a tremendous markup. They wouldn't sell it. I guess they were upset and outraged that somebody else would be playing this part, at least in the close-ups. So finally, another shirt was procured, which is a different shirt, and the stripes are not the same. And we recut the scene using all of the wide shots from the original shoot with the original actor and the original shirt that he wore, and close-ups of a new child that when we cut around to the face with a different shirt. And if you look closely, you may be able to discern the difference. I can see it very clearly. But through the magic of film, it seems to work very well. Nobody ever catches it.
There was never any vast enthusiasm about this movie, and when it went out and won its first weekend and beat some fairly big filmmakers who were opening in the market at the same time, everybody was astounded. It's like, whoa, that's great. Thanks for winning the weekend for us. So we went in Monday morning and said, now, how much can we expect in terms of support, in terms of TV buy, print ads, whatever? And they said, oh, nothing. I said, wait a minute, we just won the weekend, we're #1. I said, oh yeah, but you know, it won't last. So nothing. We said, nothing? They said, yeah, nothing. We said, well, what does that mean, nothing? No TV, no print. Like, okay. Fortunately, John Daly went out, borrowed some money through some, you know, Canadian tax credit or something, and bought some TV time and bought some print. I think he only bought print, come to think of it, and managed to just put out enough information that people could find the theaters. The following weekend, the film went up, which is really unprecedented, you know. And then the weekend after that, which was a Thanksgiving weekend, so it's sort of a bit of a cheat, it went up again. It wasn't until that moment that people realized that it was, you know, something special. Until then, it was just a down and dirty action exploitation film. 1 week in and out.
Randy Frakes and I wrote the novelization for Terminator. And now the way you do that is that, you know, they get that thing in the pipeline so that when the movie comes out, the book is on the bookstore shelves. And they didn't do it that way. I don't know why. But what happened was, I think Terminator surprised them. I think they thought they were going to get a Roger Corman 2 weeks in the theater and bang, 2 weeks it's out and we all make a little bit of money and we go on to the next thing. And what Jim gave them was a really good movie. So they kind of went, well, where's our novelization? Where's our merchandising? Where's this and where's that? Well, you know, I mean, the horse was already out of the barn and kind of way gone, but they thought, well, if we hurry really quick, maybe we can do this. And essentially, Jim asked Randy and I if we could do it quickly. And we got a hold of the script. sat down, and I think we just cut the son of a gun right in half. We just went off. I think we did it in 2 weeks or 3 weeks or something like that.